after you take this computer architecture class, I want you to really remember at least two things. The two things to remember is the first one is pipelining, and the second one is cache. That's the two most important topics in this computer architecture course. So, about pipelining, we actually learned three things, right? What is the concept of pipelining? That's the first one. And secondly, how pipelining works, right? Finally, how we can improve the performance of pipelining using forwarding techniques plus branch prediction. All these things actually improves improve the performance of pipelining. We'll do the same thing. So, first of all, we're gonna talk about the concept of memory hierarchy and caching. So for the caching, we also have to we'll talk about three things too. First, what is the concept of caching? Secondly, how caches work, and third, how make these caches works better. I mean, achieve better performance. So we're gonna go over all these things during the rest of this course. So today we're gonna start with the topic of memory hierarchy. So here, that's the plan. Before we do that, let's take a look, get a little bit of this technology side of how, what are those storage technologies and trends. Especially, today we're going to talk about RAM, DRAM and SRAM. So what they are, how they work, what are their characteristics, all these things we're going to go over first, and then we're going to move on to, the locality of reference, which is very important characteristic of the memory accesses, memory access pattern. And finally, we're going to introduce the notion of caching in the last part of this lecture. So let's start with, let's briefly look into today's storage technologies and trends, especially RAM. So RAM is basically memory, right? It stands for random access memory. So RAM is traditionally packaged as a chip. If you open your computer, there's a DIMM, right? If it's like a memory module, which actually has multiple chips in it, and Korea is very famous for this a memory business and memory chips. So basic storage unit is normally a cell. So memory cell actually can store 1 bit of information. So if you have taken this logic design course, we already learned how to make flip-flop, right? So basically we start with cross-coupled inverter. We put two inverters together to store 1 bit of information, and then we and so on, right? So that's basically the cell. So we can store 1 bit per cell, and we actually use multiple RAM chips to form our memory. And there are two flavors of RAM. The first one is called SRAM. SRAM stands for static RAM. So each cell stores 1 bit with a 4 or 6 transistor circuit. And this SRAM retains value indefinitely. It doesn't lose value. Okay? So as long as this power is provided. So as long as we provide power, the value will be retained forever. And this is faster and more expensive than DRAM, okay, static RAM. In contrast, dynamic RAM or DRAM, each cell actually consists of a single capacitor. Okay, it's a very simple structure. But it's actually but value must be refreshed every 10 to 100 milliseconds, which means that actually I can draw this a schematic. So SRAM actually looks like this. SRAM circuit. Basically, we actually have cross-coupled inverter, right? So if you actually have cross-coupled inverter, we can store 1 bit of information, right? Because there are two stable states. For example, if you store 1 here, then the other value will be 0, right? Then maybe this one means 1. But we can actually do the opposite. Let's say we store 0 here, then the value will be 1 here. Then this circuit will be stable in this state as well, right? So depending on the state, we can actually store one bit of information. It'll be either 1 or 0, right? Of course, we place what is called like an access transistor here. This is like access transistor. It's like a switch, right? So sometimes we want to actually overwrite the value to update the value, right? In that case, we drive the new value through this transistor so that we can actually update the value, right, in the memory cell. So this one is like 6 transistor SRAM cell. Okay, because each like inverter takes 2 transistors, so it's like a 6 transistor SRAM cell. But in contrast, DRAM looks like this. DRAM actually has only capacitor. Okay, because you have capacitor, you can actually store 1 bit of information. Depending on whether it's charged or discharged. You can actually, it's like a battery, right? Micro battery. So if you fully charge it, that's 1. If it's empty, then that's 0, right? You can store like 1 bit of information. Of course, we also need like an access transistor. This is called access transistor. And these two are also access transistors, these two. So those access transistor is used when to actually connect to the outside signal or when to disconnect so that we can actually overwrite the value of the cell, right? So this one actually control the when to write, when to update the value. Okay. So this one is SRAM and DRAM. So this one is called like 1T, 1C DRAM cell. Because 1T, 1C means 1 transistor and 1 capacitor. So in this case, we only have 6 transistors, right? So this one is 6 transistor SRAM cell, and this is 1T, 1C DRAM cell. So if you see these two schematic, which one will be cheaper? Obviously, this one looks simpler, right? So this one is actually cheaper. So that means, this DRAM actually provides a lot. So for the same cost, it actually provides much greater density. Okay, so you can actually put more bits for the same area of the chip, right? So this actually provides greater density, so it's cheaper. But the problem with DRAM is that this cell actually lose value. So let's say you actually fully charge it, like a plus, 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 and minus, minus, minus. Let's say, I assume you know what's capacitor, right? You've learned from the physics, right? Physics course. Let's say you fully charge this capacitor and leave it forever. Then leave it like that forever. It continually lose this charge because there's some like a back path through which actually you lose a charge, so that this one will be gradually discharged, even though this one is completely disconnected. There's some like a hidden path to actually lose this charge, right? So eventually, even though you actually started with like a fully charged capacitor, after some period of time, you're going to lose the charge. So that's the reason why you need to do what is called refresh. So refresh means you have to actually read the value of the capacitor and write it afresh. I mean, write again, write the same value again. Then now this one actually recover the original value. Okay, so that's basically called like a refresh. So in case of the dynamic DRAM, the good things about dynamic RAM is it's cheaper, and bad thing is that you need to actually refresh this like a capacitor every 10 to like 100 milliseconds for all the cell in your chip. Okay, that's kind of significant cost, operational cost. So DRAM is actually slower and cheaper than DRAM, and SRAM is actually faster and more expensive than DRAM. Okay, that's the constant probe. So here's a trend. Here's a summary comparison between SRAM and DRAM. So SRAM usually takes like 4 or 6 transistors per bit. I mean, it actually uses more transistors. And access time, let's say access time of like SRAM is 1x, but then like a DRAM access time is like a 10x slower. It's much slower than SRAM. So this one is much faster. And needs refresh. For SRAM, no. Because in SRAM, this cross-coupled inverter keep like reinforcing the value, right? Because it keep this value stable. Because now we actually have like a inverter circuit, like zero enforce 1, 1 enforce 0, so that there's no like loss of value. But in case of DRAM, you need refresh because this charge will be lost after some period of time, right? So you need refresh. You need EDC, like error detection code. So EDC is something like parity, maybe. You use some extra bit to detecting an error. When the error correction code is in SRAM, maybe sometimes you need like a EDC, error detection code, but DRAM you almost always need this EDC because for like a stable operation, you need to have this like EDC, error detection code. And cost-wise, DRAM actually has benefit. So if you say DRAM's cost is 1x, that's the baseline, then the cost of SRAM is actually much higher. It's got 100x. Then you may actually have a question, why this one actually like disproportionately higher cost? Because if you only compare these two, like transistors per bit, it'll be like a 4 to 6 right, ratio. But the cost-wise, this one is almost like 100x more expensive. So why is so much different? Where this like difference actually where this difference comes from? Any guess? Although the number of transistors, there's only like a 4 to 6x difference, but the cost-wise, this one is like 100x more expensive. Why is like that much expensive? Any guess? 왜 그럴까요? 그러니까 트랜지스터의 개수로 보면은 한 4배 정도밖에 안 쓰는, 4배에서 6배 정도밖에 안 쓰는데 왜 가격은 100배나 비쌀까? Yes, economy of scale. So if you actually have like a lot larger volume, then actually you can cut this cost a lot more. So generally this actually DRAM actually has a lot more supplies. I mean, it's a lot more scale, it's producing much greater scale than SRAM. So this one actually has like lower cost. It's an economy of scale. So this SRAM is typically used for cache memories. DRAM is used for main memory and frame buffers and so on. So this cache memory this one is integrated on chip. Okay, so if you actually have your CPU, there are a bunch of like SRAM blocks, such as like for example like a register file. So if you have like a register file, then register file is built using SRAM because it needs like a fast access. But your like main memory, like this, like the main memory is actually placed off chip, off CPU. So and this one is actually used. We use DRAM to actually make main memory. Also, like a frame buffers for video. So if you actually have like this like video, this display module, you actually have like a frame buffer that actually put this like pixel information. So this one also requires a lot of memory, because you need to store this value of pixels, and then you display it. So that kind of frame buffer also use like DRAM. So let's take a look into the DRAM organization. So here, this one is a very simplified version of DRAM structure. So typically, this DRAM chip actually has two-dimensional array. This one is like a 2D memory array. Okay, and let's say it actually consists of multiple what is called supercells. I mean, let's say this one consists of multiple supercell, and each supercell actually has like 8 bits in it. In this specific example, so we call it like a D times W DRAM. So D times W DRAM means we actually have D supercells. In this case, how many supercells do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 16 supercells, right? So we have 16 supercells here, which is D. And each supercell actually has 8 bits in it. It's an assumption for this specific like a DRAM device. So this W is 8. So this one is called like a 16 times 8 DRAM. So it means like a 16 supercells, and each supercell actually has 8 bits. So total number of bits will be 16 times 8, right? So the total number of bits will be 16 times 8, which is 128 bits. Of course, in real DRAM, this size is much bigger. I mean, we have a lot more, supercells, so that we actually have like 8 gigabits. 8 gigabit like DRAM is kind of common today. And this supercell is organized in like a two-dimensional, like rows and columns. These 16 supercells, we actually have like 4 rows times 4 columns, right? So in this way, we actually have 16 supercell. And this, let's say this supercell is specifically referring to 2, 1. So row 2 and column 1. Okay? So that's basically basic structure of DRAM, although we actually basically scale it down to make it basically simplified it for like illustrative purpose. But basically the real DRAM is kind of a scaled up version of this thing. And we have like this one is called like an address bus. And this one is like a data bus. So the way it works is we send like address, right, through address bus. Then the value will be returned through data bus. Okay, so we actually have like a 2-bit. We assume like a 2-bit address bus and 8-bit data bus. That's the assumption. Then how this DRAM works. So this one actually shows an example. By the way, this DRAM access, because now we actually have like 16 supercells, we actually have to refer to specific. We need like 4 bits to refer to a specific supercell, right? Because we actually have like 15 and 16 different distinct like address for each of these supercells. So we actually have to first send the address of the supercell, and then the data will come back after a little bit of delay, of course. Then in this case, the step 1, we first send the message, what is called like a row access strobe, or RAS, to select row 2. So in the step 1, you first send this RAS request. RAS is row address strobe, which actually selects a specific row. First, in order to access this supercell 2-1, like this guy, you have to first send RAS command to the DRAM. Then you send like RAS command with like address 2. Then the value of entire row 2, this one, will be copied down to internal row buffer. There's a row buffer internally. So once DRAM receives this RAS command, this entire row 2 will be copied over to internal row buffer, like this. So now we actually get the value. Get the value of this entire like a row into the internal row buffer. And step 2, now you send what is called like a column address strobe, CAS, like column request. So in this case, now you send like a CAS 1. So CAS 1 is basically you want to access the specific like column 1 in this like row buffer. So then DRAM receive this command, and it select a specific like column, and then send this data, like 8-bit data, back to this memory controller. This, and then this value will be sent to the CPU like a pipeline. Okay, like this. So this is basically how this memory access actually works. But in reality, now you actually have like a multiple chips. I don't know how many of you actually have upgraded this DRAM yourself. If you have ever upgraded this DRAM module, you basically buy what is called DIMM, dual inline memory module, like a DIMM. Like I don't know how many of you have seen this module before. If you have like a small like a memory board with like a bunch of like DRAM chips in it, like this, typically like 8 or 9. And then now you actually bunch up something like some like small like signal is there. You place this like a DRAM module into your motherboard, then you upgrade this like memory, right? So this one is called like a memory module. or it's also called DIMM, Dual Inline Memory Module. It stands for DIMM. This is called DIMM. So once you have DIMM, there are like multiple chips. Like in this example, you have 8 like chips, and they actually, when you actually send like receive like a request like a specific address, request data from specific address, all of these like 8 chips are responsible for providing some piece of this information. So if you more specifically, let's say you want to access certain like a row and column, then each chip provide 8 bits of information. Okay, because we assume like a supercell size was like 8 bits, right? So if you provide this address, like a row address and column address, then all of these like 8 chips actually respond to the request to provide 8 bits from each chip. So now together you're going to end up like getting like 64 bits from 8 chips, because each chip actually provide 8 bits of information. Then this like you actually gather like this like 8 bits together to form like a 64-bit word. And then that information, like 64-bit information, will be sent back to the CPU. Okay. And this one will be sent to the CPU like this. That's the like structure of the memory module. And that's kind of basic operation, but there are multiple like enhancements made to DRAM device. The DRAM, basically like a DRAM cell structure has not changed much since like the first invention in 1960s. But there are a lot better but there are a lot of improvements for like interfacing logic and I/O in DRAM. Even though the cell structure itself did not really change much, there's a lot of enhancements around this cells for this interfacing, for the interface of DRAM. So the first innovation was synchronous DRAM. So originally, like a DRAM used what's called asynchronous interface. So asynchronous interface means you send like a request, then this will actually send like this DRAM device send back the data with like asynchronously. Meaning that you don't know when it's coming back. So it actually sends the data back with like complete signal, so that you do like communicate with like some like handshaking with the device using like a specific like a designated signal. But these days we use what is called synchronous DRAM, meaning that you actually have clock signal to drive this DRAM, and once you send the request comes back, the data comes back after like some number of cycles. That's kind of part of the spec, the specifications. So now we actually basically all this like a DRAM use this the signal, a clock signal, to be synchronous. That's kind of one feature of today's modern like DRAM devices. And also DDR, like double data rate, synchronous DRAM is pretty common. So in this case, we receive this data not only in the positive edge of the clock, but also like negative edge of the clock as well. So if you have like CPU chip here, and we actually have memory controller, and now we actually have DRAM here, and now we actually send like an address, and data comes back like this between the two. And we also have a clock signal like this, right? So if you have a clock signal like this, you send the address on specific like a clock cycle, and then this data comes back after starting at the specific like clock cycle. And the DDR, the double data rate, means this data comes not only in every like rising edge of the clock, but also like a falling edge of the clock as well. So data, comes in the data like the first data comes in like this clock cycle, and the second data comes in the falling edge of the cycle, falling edge of the clock, and third one comes at the next rising edge of the clock, and the fourth one comes at the next falling edge of the clock. So that it's like, you know, we actually it's like we have like a 2x faster clock, right? Because now we send and receive like 2 bits per cycle per pin. So now instead of like sending like a 1 bit per pin every cycle, now we actually send 2 bits by sending first bit in the rising edge, the second bit in the falling edge. So every single pin actually sends like a 2 bits every clock cycle. That's called DDR, like double data rate. And today it's like a DRAM standard. If you buy PC, I mean like desktop, then DDR4 is the standard. I don't know how many of you seen like DDR4? I mean this spec. So if you actually see the specification of a PC, the memory module is kind of, you know, DDR4, you know, 21600 or something like this. So that's kind of grade of your memory. So DDR4 is the standard. I mean the standard DRAM today, and this one actually shows, you know, how much data you can send during the single, you know, clock cycle. So pretty much like all these like most server and desktop systems actually use this DDR double data rate DRAM. So far, you know, we talked about volatile memory. So volatile memory means, you know, you lose the data if the power goes off. That's like a volatile memory. And both like a DRAM and SRAM are volatile, in the sense that once you cut off the power, the old data will go away, right? So that's like volatile memory. But in contrast, there's like non-volatile memories. So non-volatile memories, once you actually put the value in it, the data will be still there even though you actually cut off the power. Okay, that's called like a non-volatile memory, or NVM. So what is the best known NVM today? Non-volatile memory device. Flash, you know, flash memory. So flash memory is the best known example of NVM, non-volatile memory today. You know, if you use like a USB, I use USB here, you know, USB drive, and you know, SSD, you know, all these things are made out of flash devices, right? And flash devices are the best known example of non-volatile memory, NVM. So non-volatile memories retain their value even if power goes off. So you know, the examples of an NVM include like a ROM, you know, PROM, EPROM, E-square PROM. You know, all these things are variants of ROM. So ROM is basically, you know, you actually have like array of like cells, and each cell actually has some fuse in it, like a fuse, like, you know, some, you know, metal wire, and then you selectively, you know, remove this fuse. Then actually you can program this like a memory chip, and then the value will be stored forever, even though the power goes off. So that's how, you know, this ROM device work. I mean, you know, ROM is basically read-only memory. You know, consists of like a bunch of like, you know, array of fuse. Usually this one is built by using like an array of fuse. And then you selectively cut this fuse, and then you actually store some information in it, and that value will be retained even though the power goes off. Okay, and PROM is programmable ROM. So you know, actually ROM with some like a programmable interface, and EPROM is, you know, you can actually erase them in bulk. I mean, instead of like erasing like one by one, you can actually do, you know, program this like ROM more efficiently. That's like an EPROM. And E-square PROM or EEPROM is, you know, you can erase, you know, program this value electronically. I mean, not really using like this like X-ray or some ultraviolet ultraviolet ray. But you know, all these things are not very widely used today, and this one actually is the king. The flash memory is the king of non-volatile memory today. So all of this like a non-volatility. Whenever you actually need some like a non-volatility, we actually use flash memory these days. But the downside of flash memory is that its write speed is pretty slow. first of all, it takes a lot of time to write some value into the flash, and secondly, it actually wears out. So wears out means that once you write like 100,000 times to like a specific cell, then the cell dies. Okay, so it wears out after about like 100,000 erasings, 100,000 like programs. Then the device actually dies. You cannot use it anymore. So what we use those like non-volatile memory for, first of all, you can actually use this NVM for firmware. So firmware means something like a BIOS. If you turn off your computer, there's some like a program that actually boots your computer, right? Called BIOS, right? So those like BIOS code is stored in non-volatile memory because that must be stored in like some it's like a fixed piece of code that actually boots your computer. That must be stored in non-volatile memory. BIOS, controller for disk, network card, graphics accelerator, and so on. There's some like firmware programs are stored in NVM. Also, we actually use this NVM technology for SSD, solid state disk, and also like disk caches. They are basically used for this non-volatile memory. So let's think about how this like memory is actually connected to the CPU. Because last time, we actually talked about the pipelining, and if you remember, we actually had 5 stages, right? F, D, W, E, M, W, right? And we actually had 2 memories, right? We actually had instruction memory here. We actually had data memory here, if you remember correctly. You have like instruction memory and data memory. And we're talking about what these like 2 blocks actually look like, right? If you want to access memory, you actually CPU actually make a request to access like a specific memory address, right? Then how it works. So that's what I cover in this slide. So let's say we actually have a bus here. So this is called system bus. Bus is collection of parallel wires. It's nothing but just wires. Bus is collection of wires that carry address, data, or control signal. Okay, so we actually have 2 buses here. The first one is called system bus that actually connects, CPU chip to I/O bridge, and second bus is memory bus that actually connects, I/O bridge to main memory. So I/O bridge also connects the other like I/O device too. Maybe if you use like a USB, maybe USB also is connected to here. If you use Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi is also connected to here. All I/O bridge actually connects a bunch of these like I/O devices and memory. Also like memory. So in this case, now we have a CPU chip. This actually have like a system bus. So now this system bus connects this CPU and I/O bridge, and memory bus, which connects this I/O bridge to main memory, like memory chips. Okay, but this one is like an old view of this system. Actually, today's computer, today's like a processor, actually have this memory controller inside the CPU chip. So it actually has dedicated like memory bus, then memory channel, just directly coming out of the CPU. So now we have memory controller here, and then memory chip here, like a main memory. And this one's memory bus. So this one is what today's CPU looks like. They actually integrate this like a memory controller in it, and then these pins, like this memory bus, come directly out of this CPU chip. So that's today's design. So this one is more like older, like a 90s design. So they actually have like a dedicated like I/O bridge. So now you actually communicate these two things. They communicate using a system bus, and there's like a memory bus coming out of this I/O bridge. So as I said, a bus is collection of parallel wires that carry address, data and control signal. And buses are typically shared by multiple devices. Okay? That's the reason why it's called bus. Bus is basically shared by many agents, right? It's shared bus, right? So, but in this context, a bus means basically shared like collection of wires driven by multiple devices. So here is how this like memory transaction actually works. Let's say your CPU tries to execute this move instruction, move Q, A RAX, meaning that you access like a specific memory location A and load the value from that location to register RAX. So if that happens, the CPU first make a request to access this this specific memory address. The first step, the CPU places address A on the memory bus like this. It actually send this like a this address on memory bus. Then this main memory, which is DRAM, this DRAM chip actually receive this address. Of course, this address A will be broken down into row address and column address to actually have two steps. You first specify row address followed by column address, right? This A will be divided by it actually have a row address and a column address like this. So you actually send this two piece of address. Then main memory A reads value at memory location A, and you send it through memory bus. The memory reads the value of A from the memory bus and retrieves the word X. Let's say the value of this word is X, and place this value back to the bus. Right? Now this value X will be placed on this memory bus, and this one will be further actually propagated through the system bus, and eventually it will get to the register file in the pipeline and get to the register file. Like this. So CPU read like word X from the bus and copies it to the register RAX. Okay. Then what about the write? Write is the opposite. So write, you actually CPU plays again. CPU plays address A on the bus, and this main memory reads the address A, and it waits for the corresponding data to arrive. Because in order to write some value, let's say you execute this instruction, then what it does is you copy the contents of address RAX to the memory location A. It's like a store instruction. So in this case, you first send the address you want to copy the data to. In the step 2, now you send this value, Y. Let's say the value of RAX register is Y in this case. Then in step 2, now the CPU plays this data word Y on the bus, like memory bus. Then this memory will receive both like A address and value pair. And this main memory will actually update the value of the location A, the address A, with the value Y. Right? So that's how this store, this is like a store instruction, right? This is how like a store instruction works. But let's think about it. If you really want to access, this like a memory every time you want to access a memory, how many cycles is it going to take? I mean, like today's processor actually running at like a 3 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz or 3 gigahertz, right? But this one actually takes like let's say like 100 nanoseconds to read. So let's say today's CPU, let's say this is CPU, runs at let's say 2 gigahertz. Then what will be the cycle time of this CPU? What is the single like a clock cycle time for this CPU? 얼마죠? 이 cycle time은 CPU의 cycle time은 frequency의 역수겠죠. Inverse of frequency, right? So it will be 0.5 nanosecond. But typically, if you want to read like this memory, DRAM, it takes maybe somewhere like 15 nanoseconds. Okay? Then how many cycles is going to take? CPU cycle is going to take to read it. Right? Because your CPU actually runs, fetch like a new instruction every 0.5 nanosecond. But it takes like, let's say it takes like a 50 nanosecond. That means whenever you have to send a request, it takes like a 100 CPU clock cycles to fetch your value. It's really slow, right? So we need to fill this gap. How we can fill this gap of this like a 0.5 nanosecond fetch time? Every cycle you want to fetch a new instruction, but it takes like a 15 nanosecond to access this like a DRAM. So there's a huge performance gap between CPU and memory, right? So every time you want to access memory, you have to pay 100 CPU cycles, to fetch just a single word, which is pretty bad. So that's the reason why we actually introduced cache. So now, between these two things, we place what is called cache. And cache solves the problem of this like a long access time of memory. So I'm going to explain what cache can do for us. So here, let's think about the CPU and memory performance gap. So this one is a historical trend line. So x-axis is the year. So we actually track this like a trend from 1985 up until recently, until 2015. And this one actually shows the historical like a timeline in log scale, by the way. This one is log scale and in nanosecond. So this one is like a typical access time, like how much time it takes to fetch a single word of data. And this CPU time means it's like a clock cycle time, what's the clock cycle time of a CPU. So if you see here, the CPU clock cycle time is somewhere between like a 3 to 4 gigahertz today, right? CPU clock rate is 3 to 4 gigahertz if you use like a desktop. So this one is somewhere like 0.3 through 0.25 nanosecond cycle time. So our CPU is here because it's somewhere between 1.0 and 0.1, right? Because cycle time is somewhere between 0.3 and 0.25. In contrast, what is the access time for DRAM? As I said, DRAM access time is somewhere like 50 nanoseconds. That's the assumption. Let's say 50 nanosecond. Of course, depending on access pattern, but maybe in the worst case, let's say it takes as much as like a 50 nanosecond. So then DRAM access time is actually here between 10 and 100. And this SRAM is actually much faster. So SRAM's access time is somewhere near like 1 nanosecond. Okay, so it's close to 1 nanosecond. So SRAM access time is in the range of somewhere between, it's close to like 1 nanosecond. And this one is like 50 nanosecond. What about disk? So if you want to fetch like a block from the disk, it takes like millisecond range. It takes like a millisecond, up to like a millisecond to read the value. So this one is like a more of like a millisecond range. What about SSD? So probably if you actually, maybe one of the best way to upgrade your system's performance is replace your disk with SSD. Because if you replace SSD, it boots up a lot faster, and so on, right? And then this one actually has access time in the range of microseconds. Okay, that's a rough performance range, like a SSD. This is a hard disk. Hard disk in like a millisecond range, SSD in microsecond range. DRAM is like a tenth of nanosecond, and SRAM is like a 1 nanosecond or lower. And CPU clock rate is somewhere like every clock cycle time is something like 0.3 nanosecond, or 0.2 nanosecond, and so on. So that's rough time range, and also this like a historical trend line. And the problem is a gap between the CPU clock rate and memory. So here, in 1980s, the DRAM access time and CPU clock cycle were comparable, meaning that every single cycle you could actually read like a word from DRAM because the access time of DRAM is close to CPU like clock cycle time. So in other words, to access like a memory, you read some value from like a DRAM, it took like one CPU cycle, right? In this era, in like 30 years ago. But now, if you see, the difference between DRAM and CPU is like this. In red, that's the performance gap. There's a performance gap between DRAM access time and CPU, right? In 30 years ago, it took one CPU cycle to read the value from DRAM, but now it takes like 100 like cycles to read value from DRAM. Okay? So the reason was the CPU cycle time was continuously scaled down. So now we actually have like a nanosecond, like a split nanosecond of cycle time. But the DRAM access time actually scales much slowly. It's almost like much flatter, right? So now we actually have like a gap, big and widening gap between DRAM main memory performance and CPU performance. So this one is called, by the way, this is called memory wall problem. Okay? So memory wall problem means, now eventually your memory system becomes the bottleneck of everything in your CPU performance. Okay? 네. 네. 좋은 질문인데요. 그러니까 학생의 질문은 어차피 그 CPU도 동기화돼가지고 클럭으로 이렇게 드라이브 되면은 그 클락 사이클이 스케일 되니까 빨라지는 거 아니냐고 이렇게 물어보는데요. 그 I/O로는 맞아요. 그러니까 I/O로는 이제 실제로 이제 메모리를 읽는 부분을 두 개로 나눌 수가 있는데 그 셀 어레이에서 그 아까 셀에 있는 데이터를 가져오는 부분이랑 그다음에 그 읽어온 데이터를 CPU 쪽에다가 그 버스에다 실어가지고 전달해주는 I/O 부분 두 개로 나눌 수가 있는데요. I/O 부분은 확실히 줄었어요. I/O 부분은 확실히 그 버스 그 클락 레이시 빨라지고 이래가지고 확실히 줄었는데 문제는 안 주는 부분이 어느 부분이냐면 그 DRAM 셀 어레이를 액세스하는 부분은 여전히 안 줄어요. 그러니까 무슨 얘기냐면은 리퀘스트를 던지면은 처음에 메모리 셀에서 그 값을 읽어와가지고 그거를 이제 I/O에다 실어가지고 다시 CPU 쪽에 돌려줘야 되잖아요. 그러니까 CPU 쪽에 돌려주는 부분은 되게 빨라졌는데 여전히 그 I/O 그러니까 그 셀을 액세스하는 그 부분은 여전히 느린 거죠. 그래서 결국은 그것 때문에 버틀렉이 걸려가지고 이렇게 속도가 여전히 느린 거죠. 대신 어떤 방향으로 발전했냐면 어차피 하나의 리퀘스트를 읽어오는 시간은 크게 줄지 않았는데 대신 문제는 이제 그러면 I/O는 되게 빨라졌잖아요. 그럼 훨씬 많은 데이터를 CPU 쪽에 보내줄 수 있거든요. 그래서 어떻게 발전을 했냐면 이 하나의 셀을 이게 메모리 액세스 셀에서 읽어오는 시간을 못 줄이니까 이런 어레이를 여러 개 만들어. 여러 개 만들어서 리퀘스트를 동시에 여러 개의 어레이에서 동시에 처리해서 이 버스는 되게 비지하게 이 리퀘스트 처리하는 동안에 얘도 처리해가지고 벌스트로 이제 여러 개의 리퀘스트를 여러 개의 그 어레이에서 동시에 보내줘서 이 I/O 채널의 유틸라이제이션을 높여주는 그런 방향으로 발전했어요. 그래서 so in summary, DRAM actually performance has improved quite a bit, not in terms of latency, but in terms of throughput. So now we actually have multiple cell arrays in it in a single device, so that now we overlap, processing of multiple requests over like a multiple arrays. So in that way, we can actually improve the throughput of like a DRAM device, but not the latency of access time of single request. Okay. Any other questions about the technology trend? Okay. So this one actually compares the storage trend, SRAM, DRAM, and disk, because now there are three, major, memory/storage devices: SRAM device, DRAM device, and disk. Like traditionally, it's a hard disk. So this one actually compares both the access time and cost per megabyte. It compares the two. So this is scaling trend between 1985 through 2015. So let's take a look at SRAM first. So in SRAM, I mean the cost per megabyte has scaled down quite a bit. So in this like a 30-year period, it's actually scaled down by the factor of 116. If you compare these two numbers, okay. So if you compare these two, in 1985, 1 megabyte of SRAM cost $2,900. It's very expensive. But today, like in 2015, it only costs like same amount of like memory, the storage, only costs like $25. The scale down factor was more than like 100. Also, the access time scaled quite a bit. So in like 1985, access time for single like SRAM cell was about 150 nanosecond, but it's only like 1.3 nanosecond. So it's like over like 100 scale, 100x improvement, right? But what about DRAM? So DRAM actually scales a lot more dramatically. So in this case, the cost per megabyte has been scaled by like amazing factor of 44,000. So in like 1985, you actually had to pay $880 to buy like a single megabyte DRAM, but now the cost for the same device is only like a 0.02. So it's a 44,000 times scaling in terms of like a dollar per megabyte. But access time actually scales down a lot slowly, as I said, because even though you scale up this like a frequency of this like I/O, it's eventually bottlenecked by the access time of the cell, which doesn't really scale very well. So in this like a 30-year period, it's scaled down only by a factor of 10. It's much slower. I mean, the DRAM access times scales much more slowly. So it only scaled down by a factor of 10, and the typical size of DRAM also scaled a lot. What about disk? In case of disk, we actually have like more like reduction of the cost for gigabyte. So in 1985, you had to pay like $100,000 to buy a 1 gigabyte drive, but now you only pay like $0.03 per gigabyte, because now we use like terabyte like hard disk, right? I don't know. You guys check this cost of this 1 terabyte or 4 terabyte like hard disk. I don't know. 한 4테라바이트짜리 얼마나 하죠 요즘? 4테라바이트 디스크 한 10만 원 하나? Maybe like 한 10만 원? 네. 30만 원이나요? 4테라가? 2테라? Anyway, okay. some 10만 원. Yeah, that's the range. Like 4 terabyte, you have to pay like maybe 20만 원, maybe 30만 원 range, or 10만 원. I don't know. So the cost per gigabyte has been reduced by a factor of 3 million times. It's a lot, right? So it's a lot of reduction. And access time, of course, again, in case of disk, this access time actually scaled much slowly too. So it has been improved by a factor of 25. So in summary, in both like a DRAM and disk, this capacity, or dollar per like capacity, scales much faster than this like access time.
Why is it the prices going down? Aren't there any payments that the company can use?
You mean why cost goes down?
Yeah. Is it because of competition, or is there patents that the company can monopolize on?
All of what you mentioned. Is there a competition, and also.
Are there any patents so the company can like keep their advantage on some research that like in terms of medicine, the cost of the medicine keeps high, remains high for maybe 10 years or so, and then it goes down.
Okay.
So aren't there any patents?
No. Only there are like chicken games. So there are some like perhaps, I mean, let's think that I can explain it this way. So in order to, of course, it's both like a DRAM and disk, like a very highly competitive market. First of all, very highly competitive market, and you actually have to provide some differentiate yourself, right, with your competitor. right, in the next generation. And this, this like a DRAM and disk, is very extremely cost-sensitive market. So it also like a second like a characteristic is a winner takes all. I mean, there's only one or two vendors which actually takes all the benefits. So competition is really high, and very cost sensitive, and winner takes all. All these three things are the characteristics of the market, and as a result, everyone actually tries to reduce the cost per bit. I mean, how can you provide the same device at a lower cost? That's the only, perhaps the most important like point of competition, what they compete for. So that's the reason why they actually have this amazing, dramatic, scale down of the cost. That's my that's what I think. I mean, this is my explanation of your question. And there's no other like factors you can differentiate. I mean, because it's pretty much standardized. It's commodity. So there's not much you can do other than just cutting the cost. No other like point of differentiation. So I think that's the result. As a result, we actually have dramatic scale down of the cost over the 30 years. And it'll probably continue like this. That's a market. That's the market of this. That's the characteristic of this market. Okay. And Korea is doing really well in doing this game. So we make a lot of money out of it. So this one actually shows that the trend of CPU. We can do the same analysis of CPU. So if you see the CPU performance analysis compared to like a 1985, where this 286 machine was introduced, the clock rate was 6 megahertz. It's not gigahertz, 6 megahertz, right? In like 30 years ago, probably none of you were born, I assume. At the time, we actually had PC of like running like 6 megahertz. It's really slow, and this clock rate also was also scaled continuously, and then it reached like 3.3 gigahertz in like early 2000. In 2003, we actually hit like a 3 gigahertz mark. So in Pentium 4, we actually had like a 3.3 gigahertz in around 2003. So this one clock cycle time is like 0.3 nanosecond. In core, we actually have a single core, one core. But this one is very important, inflection point in CPU design, because still like today's CPUs are running at like a 3 to 4 gigahertz still, right? What's the reason? Why we cannot run like a 7 gigahertz or like 8 gigahertz processor or 10 gigahertz processor today? It just takes a lot of power and heat, right? So if you actually take a YouTube video, there are some actually, I don't know how many of you do like overclocking. I don't know. If you play a game, probably you try some like overclocking. Overclocking means you buy like a 3 gigahertz CPU and running like a 4 gigahertz, right? Overclocking, and overclocking actually works well. I mean, you can do overclocking. Even like some BIOS can support overclocking for you, even though the CPU actually says it's like a 3 gigahertz CPU, but you can run it in 4 gigahertz. But if you find a YouTube video, you run the same chip on like a 7 gigahertz. But it takes like a nitrogen cooler, because it generates a lot of like heat. Probably it's better to use as a stove instead of like oven or than use a CPU, right? So we jokingly say, oh, it's winter again, we have to buy a server to heat our office. I mean, but it takes a lot of power and heat. So so you need a very like big, like a gigantic like a cooler, like a water cooler, or even like a nitrogen cooler, to actually cool down your CPU. Otherwise, it'll burn. So it's it becomes really difficult to scale up the CPU clock frequency without increasing power. So that's the reason why we made a transition from here, the CPU designers decide to improve the performance by increasing number of cores instead of like increasing CPU clock rate. So now, now we actually have like a dual core, quad core, octa core, 16 core, 32 core, and so on, right? We keep scaling, all these number of cores, right? So that's basically, we actually now enter in a multi-core. So now we actually have like multiple cores on a single chip to improve the performance, while this CPU clock rate is kind of saturated. It's staying like around like 3 gigahertz, but 3 to 4 gigahertz range. In case of mobile, in your mobile CPU, it's actually running at 2 gigahertz or 2.5 gigahertz and so on. So that's a CPU performance like a scaling trend. And this is number of cores. And this effective cycle time is basically you divide the cycle time by number of cores, right? Because if you have a dual core, now you can execute 2 instructions at the same time instead of 1, right? So that's basically reflected here. Now the original cycle time is 0.5, but now we divide by number of cores, then the effective cycle time will be 0.25. And if you have like cycle time 0.4, but now we have 4 cores, then you can execute 4 instructions at the same time. So effective clock cycle is kind of 0.1. If you divide it by divide 0.4, then this is effective clock cycle time. So if you compare these numbers between like 2015 and 1985, there was like an improvement of like a 2,000 times scale. I mean, like an improvement by a factor of 2,000 between like a 1985 and 2015. Okay. But this was not only improvement. Actually, we actually have more improvement because actually this machine was 16-bit architecture. In other words, it only had like AX, DX, kind of 16-bit register. But now we actually extended the value to EAX and RAX, right? Now this width of the register, single like value, has been extended from like 16-bit to 32-bit, and now it's 64-bit. So there's like a 4x. Now we actually have like a 64-bit architecture. There's additional like a 4x improvement by having like a wider like a width of the value, wider width for word. So now if you multiply these two, it's about like a 10,000 improvement. Okay. So the question is how we can make memory as fast as SRAM and as cheap as DRAM. Okay? Let's think about ideal memory. So ideal memory is, first, it must be fast, right? It must be as fast as SRAM. Secondly, it must be cheap, right? It must be as cheap as DRAM. Okay? That's the ideal memory. As fast as DRAM, as fast as SRAM, as cheap as DRAM. So how can make such an ideal memory? Okay, and the key to bridging this like a CPU, as I said, we actually see fast CPU here, slow memory, or DRAM. Okay, so how we can bridge the gap between these two? The answer is, we actually place a cache here. This one is SRAM. Between the two, exploiting the principle of locality. Okay? So cache is nothing but a small piece of DRAM. So small piece of DRAM between CPU and DRAM, so that our hope is that most of the memory request is serviced by SRAM. This is a cache. Only in like rare cases, we actually go directly to the DRAM. It's like a slow DRAM. But in most cases, all of our memory requests are serviced by this cache, SRAM cache. That's the goal. Okay. Then how we can make this possible? Our strategy is exploiting what is called locality. The key to bridging this like a CPU and memory performance gap is the fundamental property of a computer program known as locality. So I'm going to explain what is locality. As in like pipelining, these computer architects are doing very sensible thing. I mean, very obvious, very no-nonsense approach. No-nonsense approach to design computer. You already understand the concept of locality and cache already. So let me explain why. So in the pipelining, I took an example of this laundering, right? Laundering is like you wash, dry, fold, and put it into the closet, all these things, right? Let me make the same analogy, like similar analogy to explain this like caching idea. So the challenge here is how to make it cheap and fast memory. Okay. How to make it cheap and fast memory? So we actually place like small piece of memory called like SRAM cache on the same die as CPU. Okay, in the CPU chip, now we place like a small array of SRAM, which is called cache, on the same like array. And in the CPU die, this is the cache. If you see in the figure, there is a small, like a very regular structure in the part of the chip, right? So this one is by the way cache. And off-chip DRAM, by the way, this is DIMM, what I call DIMM, dual inline memory module. So this off-chip DRAM is really slow, but it's large, cheap, but slow. And this on-chip cache is small, expensive, but fast. So by combining these two, what you want is large, cheap, and fast. Okay, so we want to make a system, memory system that's large, cheap, and fast by using these two technologies. Got small, expensive, but fast SRAM, and cheap, large, but slow DRAM. And we basically take the best of both. So then how we can exploiting the hierarchy of memory. So here is an example of book storage. Let's think about, let's say you want to store some books, right? But if you actually have like books, there are multiple levels, multiple different storages you can actually put your books. The level 1 is like on your desk. On your desk, you actually have some books on your desk. This is level 1. Level 2 is maybe like a bookstore, bookshelf, right? In your room, or you actually have some like bookshelf. And level 3 is a library. It's far. So level 1 is really cheap. Really fast, right? You can access your book on your desk really quickly, but it's actually small. But of course, some of you actually use this like a desk as a bookshelf, right? Sometimes you stack it up, but that's an exception. But generally speaking, this one is fastest but smallest, right? Level 2 is just a little bit slower to access this book because now you have to walk and then you pick up the book and put it back, take it to your desk, right? So it's a little bit slower, but actually bigger. This one is much slower because now you have to walk down to the library and you pick up the book. It's much slower, but it's a lot bigger, right? There's a hierarchy of storage. Second example, even my grandmom understands the concept of hierarchy because in her kitchen, she actually had a hanger to put some like some like cookers, which she used most like frequently. So this one is the fastest but smallest. The second one is maybe some like a drawer, like a level 2, which is like a little bit slower but actually bigger. Maybe in the basement now you have like some storage, which is slowest but biggest, right? So that's kind of idea of like how we can organize this like a storage space in hierarchy. So general rule is you actually put most frequently used one into level 1, and most like a infrequently used one in the level 3, right? And we can actually do the same thing for memory design. So in computer system, the cache memory on chip serves as level 1 or 2 storage. Level 1 and level 2 storage in like SRAM inside the CPU. And level 3 is like a DRAM. Is it level 3 or level 4? And level 5 is, what is level 5? Level 5 is actually disk, right? So now we actually have a hierarchy of storage and memory. The most frequently used data is stored in register file and cache on chip. And the next level is memory, like a DRAM. And the last level will be, this like a disk. If you actually have one more level, what will be the next level? Internet, cloud storage, right? Dropbox, or some Google Drive, and so on, right? Okay. By the way, I'm going to stop here because I want to make some few announcements before we finish the class. So here, by the way, midterm is announced. 다 입력됐어요? Okay, so we actually put your score on ETL. Please check your score. And this one is like a distribution. Now the total score is 176 instead of 200. And maximum is 169. Average is like 112. And median, all these things are stats. We're going to post these stats on the ETL, so don't worry too much about it. This is distribution. Seeing the distribution, we actually have pretty thick, like high performers and so on. And we have long tails. Standard deviation, median. If you want to check your graded exam, please come visit the TA during their office hour. By the way, they actually have office hour at 1 p.m. today. So if you want to check your graded exam, please check your score on ETL. And if you want to check out your graded exam, please see one of the TAs at 1 p.m. or any other time during their office hour. And also, homework number 4 will be out not today but next Tuesday because it's about cache. But I haven't introduced the notion of cache yet, so there's no point of explaining the homework number 4. So we're gonna, delay it by 5 days. So we're gonna do it like next Tuesday. And one more thing, we need to pick a date for makeup class because sorry to say this, but I have to attend the academic conference in the last week of this semester, between 11 and 14 December, and we cannot have a makeup class on Fridays because on Fridays, there will be an entrance exam at SNU, so we cannot have classes on Friday. So I'm suggesting what about having a makeup class on a weekday evening. Like a Monday or Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday evening. One of these, Monday or Tuesday or Thursday, Wednesday and Thursday evening. Plus, that's the only choice we have, unless we meet on Saturday and Sunday. So probably, the only reasonable way is to meet on weekdays. Only for the next 2 weeks, like next week and the following week. Is it okay to everybody? Then let me do a quick poll. Which day you have another class? So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. On which day you have a class or something equivalent so that you can make it? We actually pick a day with the least number of people who have a conflict. So how many of you actually have class on Monday evening, like at 7 p.m.? Okay, quite a few. Okay, what about Tuesday? Oh, 3. Okay. Oh, 4. What about Wednesday? 2. Or even fewer. What about Thursday? Okay, we have to pick either Tuesday or Wednesday. But I feel like we have fewer conflicts on Wednesdays. Let me do a quick poll again, just for Tuesdays and Wednesdays. How many of you have conflicts on Tuesdays? Please raise your hand. I'm going to pick exactly how many. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5. How many of you actually have conflicts on Wednesday? Oh, now we have more. What happened? 하나, 둘, 셋, 넷, 다섯, 여섯, 일곱. Okay. So Tuesday is the day. Sorry for those who actually are in conflicts, but for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to give a lecture on Tuesdays, Tuesday afternoon. To apologize for this makeup class. We may actually provide dinner for you guys, some a pizza or some a sandwich for if you show up. We're gonna provide some it's a dinner for you guys. So please take our apology. All right, that's it.